slice of life date ever. And it'll be awesome. I know.
Do you like this? Do you like this? Well, no more.
Happy Pride Month. Okay, it still counts. A couple or something years back when I was a snot-nosed 14-year-old with an aggressive lisp, I made a video talking about how I thought LGBT relationships, specifically in animation, shouldn't be forced and should instead be normalized, a statement I will forever stand by. However, in that video I used a few examples of, at the time, modern cartoons that had LGBT representation and, in my childish hubris, said that these cartoons were pretty much nailing it, when a lot of them amounted to characters that were often confirmed to be LGBT last minute or had very small instances of development throughout their respective series. I believe at the time I was of the mindset of, if these small bits of representation can help move things forward, then they should definitely be praised, which is not a bad way to look at things, I guess. But of course, 4 years of growing up and realizing I was ace turned my attention away from how these relationships were written in the context of the show, and instead directed it towards the treatment of such relationships by their networks. Because in recent years, while we've been given the illusion that things are truly moving forward with newer shows taking more risks, the events leading up to this stuff even being broadcast on television are worth talking about and paint a much bleaker picture. Censorship and cancellations all happening on the inside while the company in question hypocritically parades itself as being progressive despite being the very force stopping that progression from actually happening. There's the obvious reasons for why this happens. I'll just play a neat little sound file explaining why. When your natural goal is making money, meaning you have to come off as inoffensive as possible, challenging the status quo is a surefire way to stir up controversy in the West. Is this okay to show to my kids? Is this okay in general? Are both common responses with easy answers. There's nothing different between hetero and homosexuality other than simply swing in a different way when it comes to romance, and in theory is not going to cause Satan to rise from your child's ribcage. And for the other one, I think there was a more solid and obvious consensus before the world got so politically divided, but so long as people raise these concerns as well as keeping the places where the big money is earned in consideration, this stuff is just gonna keep happening. If you've ever felt an LGBT relationship in animation didn't feel naturally written, or if you've noticed one of your favorite shows abruptly come into a close after showcasing positive representation, then this is most likely why. A lot of this video isn't going to be new and shocking information, but in an age where companies feel more than comfortable showing support on the outside for marginalized groups of people, it's important to highlight their hypocrisy and sometimes outright malicious treatment of shows and movies that contain this kind of content, especially shining a light on how this treatment ends up harming the moments where they do allow such content to be permitted relatively last minute or in very small amounts, which can lead to in lots of moments of representation feeling forced, which directly feeds into a growing number of people who believe that it really is being forced. The idea of forced diversity is incredibly controversial for this reason, and it's also wrong, because in reality it's absolute hell to even get representation into a story, and oftentimes its inclusion can feel rushed or unsatisfying to both people in or outside certain minority groups, and it's more than likely not the fault of the writers. A good example would probably be Finn from the Star Wars sequels. For as much as there is to criticize about the complete lack of direction the sequels have, the way Finn was propped up as a huge moment for having one of the main protagonists of a Star Wars movie be a black man, only for his role to be completely diminished in the following films because of Disney's blatant chasing of China money, was kinda insulting, because there was legitimate setup in The Force Awakens for him to go far beyond the stereotype of comedic sidekick jackass. And no, the band-aid fix to this problem in Rise of Skywalker does not help and comes off as really forced powers. This is basically what happens for plenty of representation in mainstream film and television. If the corporation behind a project isn't on board, it can take days, weeks, months even for them to even budge. And by that point, creators and writers are still limited with what they can show. And if they push the boundaries just a little bit too far, then it's lights out. Or the inclusion of such representation ends up being incredibly last minute with or without the permission of the network. It's not forced diversity. That's a completely different idea that implies a piece of media is forcing a diverse character in for brownie points and a good job sticker, which is something I don't think any of what I'm about to talk about today falls under. Recently, Gravity Falls, yeah, you knew I was gonna say it, turned 10 years old, and as a result, Alex Hirsch decided to hilariously go full scorched earth with his relationship with Disney by showing many of his fights with standards and practices during the show's production.
Please revise poop face as it comes across as a replacement for shit face.
But my favorite part was when Alex basically gaslit SMP into believing Blubs and Durland were just best friends. If you're unaware, they are 100% gay, but it was only ever shown in a stereotypically comedic way until the finale where it was confirmed. Alex lied lied about the context of a scene with them when S&P showed concern, and, of course,
the gesture is approved in this context.
It's not the only instance of LGBT rep being censored in Gravity Falls either, with the episode Love God flat out removing a same-sex relationship from the storyboards as well as changing Love God's pendant. And yet despite all of this blatant censorship, Disney still has the gall to put Gravity Falls on the LGBT section? What the fuck? It was actually this post that sort of reminded me I had a video like this planned, because a lot of networks, namely Disney and Shin, do all of this corporate meddling and then act like they're allied with the community. Say it with pride. Look, shut up. Obviously times have changed slightly since Gravity Falls was in production, but it doesn't change the fact that Disney is still on some sus-ass shit. I'm gonna sound like a broken record here, but I think the Owl House arguably has one of the most naturally written and likable LGBT relationships shown in any animated show. At the very least after season 1, since I know many, including myself, have our reservations about season 1's pacing, but the path to even showing Luz and Amity being a thing was just textbook Disney. Disney leadership pretty much forbade any kind of queer content to be represented in the show, despite Dana Terrace making her intentions to have that kind of representation very clear during the show's development, actively having to fight for it to be shown. Eventually, they budged and let Dana make the show incredibly gay, but it wouldn't be a Disney executive decision without the mere implication of a monkey's paw at work. The show was abruptly cancelled, handed a shortened season 3, and the excuse we all know is that it didn't fit whatever a Disney brand is. When I can guarantee you there is nothing in the Owl House that comes close to the levels of dark Disney has showed before and has cherished before. You can say there's no definitive answer, but when one guy decides to throw out an entire show, specifically this one, after all of this, it's generally not hard to piece the stuff together, and executives do not deserve your benefit of the doubt, especially when they parade the show around. This is all on the Disney side of things, and it's easy to pick it apart because it happens so damn often. LGBT representation is a crutch for companies that act like they support the current thing when they see there's money to be made in a new market, while doing the absolute bare minimum to achieve any amount of praise and simultaneously smiting projects down that try to push boundaries much further. Because hey, that circle of success brings in the bucks, so let's not risk the profits by seeing things in a third dimension. Most shows confirm gay characters last minute when their show is already concluding so to not face the wrath of the mouse. Oftentimes it won't even be explicit because they just really can't get away with too much, like casually confirming Sasha is bi in the finale for Amphibia for a single sticker that you can miss really easily. You can almost picture Matt Braley having a gun held to his head. Any other representation is clearly just permitted so that Disney can get brownie points from it, like background characters. A large critique of LGBT rep in film and TV is that oftentimes the representation is so minuscule that it's only allowed due to how easy it is to edit and censor overseas. And oh man, is Disney a fan of doing this. You can hardly call this stuff representation because despite it being allowed, it's not major enough to make any real strides, and it's just treating your main bit of rep as a background element. Like sure, wow, thank you Starverses for being so brave as you put an easily missable gay couple in the crowd. This will have rip-roaring effects on fishing season. DuckTales tried a bit harder to get people to notice, but when you give your LGBT rep no dialogue, it's sort of like, it's sort of just, what is the point? Although the fact that 1 million moms was ready to go to war because of this is actually just pure comedic genius. I recognize that any form of representation is going to be a big thing, especially due to media sensationalism, but when it's so minuscule just for the network to pat themselves on the back while also removing it for international markets, it becomes pretty clear why they aren't so opposed to it when compared to their stance on that kind of representation being far more evident. Shows don't have to be preachy about being gay, but just letting the characters exist as any normal person would, while having a noticeable part of a story, is what there needs to be more of. There can, of course, be subtle examples of LGBT representation where the characters' sexuality and relationships don't overtake the overall narrative, but are naturally developed over time. Arcane's a pretty good example of subtly writing an LGBT relationship, and while it's been accused of queerbaiting for not being too explicit, it's written very clearly to be a slow burn. The relationship builds over time, it's very clearly not being implied, it's being written. On the other side of the spectrum, being too explicit with your representation and changing a character's sexuality at last minute can result in queerbaiting, like Shiro and Adam in Voltron, but both of these examples are just exceptions and not the rule. There's a variety of ways to write LGBT characters into your show, but the trick is always making it feel like a natural progression over time or just a natural inclusion in general. You can be explicit without making it someone's whole personality, you can be subtle without queerbaiting people. I realize I was originally talking about Disney for this section, and this video is largely about how companies treat representation, not how it's merely written, but it's worth pointing out, I think. Times have clearly changed for the better overall with Disney, like being allowed to show this stuff is still miles better than being forbidden, but they're a long way from being viewed as the inclusive, friendly face they paint themselves as. I mean, motherfuckers literally walked into Blue Sky, so they were developing a film with LGBTQ themes and were all
what in tarnation.jpg
and pushed back a production that was going along completely fine before Disney acquired them. And this was before Disney just stared Blue Sky in the face, went lol no, snapped their fingers, and then boom, dead studio. Disney is just sort of pathetic at this point. Censoring very minor representation and outright cancelling shows that go too far with it just shows that Disney's the kind of company to take out a fly with an M67 hand grenade. Cartoon Network is largely overlooked these days when it comes to their corporate fuckery, largely because Steven Universe exists, and that's kind of the main show that comes to mind when you think of LGBT representation in kids' cartoons, and everyone either calls it groundbreaking, which in many areas it is, or kicks it into the sun with enough built-up hate to fuel a thread on r/TF2. Reception to the show these days is largely split down the middle, for many justified and unjustified reasons. It's not as if CN has done nothing to earn its reputation as a company that actually cares about LGBT representation being done right. I mean, there's plenty of examples of representation in 2010s alone. However, just because they're more ahead of the curve than everyone else doesn't change the fact that money is still a primary objective. I think most of you are probably aware that Steven Universe had a gay wedding leading up to its finale between Ruby and Sapphire as they fused back into Garnet. This episode in general was one of the better episodes of season 5, and it was a moment that made perfect sense for the characters and the story. It's largely considered to be a landmark moment in children's television. However, despite this moment being paraded around as well as CN acting like they were fully for this stuff, the Steven Universe art book, End of an Era, tells a much different story. Like how Rebecca was asked to basically explain herself after the publication of a Steven Universe book titled The Answer, a book version of the episode of the same name that showed how Ruby and Sapphire met and how their relationship formed, and to this day is still considered to be one of the show's best episodes. After that episode, she was asked to play down the relationship, and implying that there were several meetings like this where she had to actively defend herself for telling queer stories. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound exactly like the Cartoon Network many have known throughout the 2010s. But it gets worse. When it came to the wedding, the idea was proposed as far back as 2015, where she was told that the international SMP may object to the direct language used when it came to the relationship, and that they were advised to tell it in a more subtle way. This is basically just keeping Rebecca and her team down as to not try and push any more boundaries. And I get that things were slightly different back in 2015. I mean, this is probably a few months before same-sex marriage was legalized in the US, so this was basically unheard of. But it definitely sort of shatters that image CN has for being progressive when they were so scared of international SMP and potential backlash. Rebecca would wait a while before proposing the idea again, and this time she was willing to lose her show over it. A show that had, whether people liked it or not, became incredibly impactful far outside of animation, and was a critical and commercial success. And behind the scenes, several arguments were made by CN to discourage her without directly addressing what their actual problem was with the wedding. Bringing up age demographics, despite the number of Cartoon Network shows that have had straight weddings before. They tried arguing that it was out of character for Steven to be excited for a wedding, which would actually be completely out of character for him. This back and forth consisted of executives grasping at straws to find a reason to not air this episode, and it looks really embarrassing on CN's part when they want to look so progressive. I mean, they were seen as a company who actually cared about this stuff, which sorry, that's funny, but they legitimately were. In the end, Rebecca was obviously allowed to have and air the wedding, but it resulted in the show being censored and pulled in numerous countries, and was the sole reason for the show not getting picked up for more episodes, which in my eyes heavily contributed to the show's finale being rushed and not very satisfying to a lot of viewers. And yet despite this, they've stayed silent on this matter, and the constant praising of their own queer representation on their Twitter is the only thing progressive about this. I'm not the biggest Steven Universe fan, although I do hold a lot of appreciation for the show's earlier seasons, but even I, at the time, was really taken aback by this wedding, only to end up being insanely annoyed when it was revealed that the show was pulled for it, because it was yet another case of executives and companies using representation as a crutch, while being super hesitant to push any boundaries as to not upset the status quo. As you probably gathered by now, there's a problem with how representation is treated in animation, and while most of it definitely stems from Disney, other companies are not innocent despite nearly all of them making a big push when it comes comes to representation. But when a company isn't revealed to be so vehemently against LGBT representation being shown, the next part is analysing if the representation they're applauding themselves for is actually worthy of the praise. This is when we get into the territory of it mostly being at the fault of writers rather than networks entirely, and I won't spend too long on that. I already mentioned two Netflix shows, Voltron and Arcane, which have different approaches to its representation, where one succeeds in an unlikely area and another blatantly fails in an area that most representation wants to be in. Arcane's a show that Netflix can be proud of if they really do care, whereas Voltron is not. Some more rapid fire examples: the Owl House is something Disney should be proud of if they care, and Star Vs is not just because of the background characters, but because of the show's mishandling of LGBT stuff in general, like Jackie suddenly having a girlfriend in the last season and possibly implying Star is bisexual. But it's only an implication and it's only a side character, because if neither were true, then Star probably wouldn't have even gotten an ending, which would have probably been for the best in retrospect. The thing that both shows have in common though is that Disney is not proud of either of them, so yeah. This video was sort of a passion project I've wanted to make for a while, because I keep seeing this stuff happen on a monthly basis. Disney's first this, Disney's first that, only for it to either be something that isn't noteworthy like a background character, or a single line of dialogue, or it's something that is noteworthy but it sacrificed its entire run just to do the thing. Things are slowly changing though, and that's a good thing for sure. Nickelodeon, for as much shit as I give them for being greedy, do have the Loud House, and yeah, the show isn't exactly good, but Sam and Luna has been a thing since season 2, and keeps showing up with no different treatment compared to the show's straight relationships. But this stuff is gonna keep happening and happening for a while, and it's good to call it out when it happens. Cartoons, whether aimed at children or adults, shouldn't be forbidden from showing queer relationships. Kids aren't going to be turned gay just from seeing a gay cartoon, and many seem to forget that kids can have these kinds of thoughts too. People don't suddenly decide that they're gay when they're older, it's something that you tend to find out and learn. And good representation should allow people to feel seen in the same way a straight relationship is portrayed across basically every media property ever made. The fact that people get up in arms over a gay kiss in a kids show but have no problem with it happening with straight couples all the time is sort of telling. Anyway, thank you for watching this. I wanted to make something for Pride Month at least, as it's been a while since I've talked about my thoughts on representation that's completely separate from a specific thing, and you may have noticed that this video doesn't really have pacing. These more casual essays are things that I want to do more of in the future, so I hope you enjoyed this one. Quality control is a myth, and fuck Disney.